The Virgin Suicides by Eugenides. Chapter 3. Flower arrangements arrived at the Lisbon house later than was customary. Because of the nature of the death, most people decided not to send flowers to the funeral home, and in general everybody put off placing their orders, unsure whether to let the catastrophe pass in silence, or to act as though the death were natural. In the end, however, everybody sent something: white roses and wreaths, clusters of orchids, weeping peonies. Peter Loomis, who delivered for FTD, said flowers crammed the Lisbons' entire living room. Bouquets exploded from chairs and lay scattered across the floor. They didn't even put them in vases, he said. Most people opted for generic cards that said, "with sympathy" or "our condolences," but some of the waspier types, accustomed to writing notes for all occasions, labored over personal responses. Mrs. Beards used a quote from Walt Whitman we took to murmuring to one another: "All goes onward and outward, nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier." Chase Buell peeked at his own mother's card as he slipped it under the Lisbon's door. It read, "I don't know what you're feeling. I won't even pretend." A few people braved personal calls. Mr. Hutch and Mr. Peters walked over to the Lisbon house on separate occasions, but their reports differed little. Mr. Lisbon invited them in, but before they could broach the painful subject, he sat them down in front of the baseball game. "He kept talking about the bullpen," Mr. Hutch said. "Hell, I pitched in college. I had to straighten him out on a few essentials. First of all, he wanted to trade Miller, though he was our only decent closer. I forgot what I'd gone over there to do," Mr. Peters said. "The guy was only half there. He kept turning the tint control up so that the infield was practically blue. Then he'd sit back down, then he'd get up again. One of the girls came in, can you tell them apart? And brought us a couple beers. Took a swig from his before handing it over." Neither of the men mentioned the suicide. "I wanted to. I really did," said Mr. Hutch. "I just never got around to it." Father Moody showed more perseverance. Mr. Lisbon welcomed the cleric as he had the other men, ushering him to a seat before the baseball game. A few minutes later, as though on cue, Mary served beers. But Father Moody wasn't deflected. During the second inning, he said, "How about we get the missus down here? Have a little chat." Mr. Lisbon hunched towards the screen. "Afraid she's not seeing anybody right now. Under the weather." "She'll see her priest," Father Moody said. He stood up to go. Mr. Lisbon held up 2 fingers. His eyes were watering. "Father," he said. "Double play ball, Father." Paolo Connelly, an altar boy, overheard Father Moody tell Fred Simpson, the choirmaster, how he had left that strange man, God forgive me for saying so, but he made him that way, and climbed the front stairs. Already the house showed signs of uncleanliness, though they were nothing compared to what was to come later. Dust balls lined the steps. A half-eaten sandwich sat atop the landing where someone had felt too sad to finish it. Because Mrs. Lisbon had stopped doing laundry or even buying detergent, the girls had taken to washing clothes by hand in the bathtub, and when Father Moody passed their bathroom, he saw shirts and pants and underthings draped over the shower curtain. "It sounded quite pleasant, actually," he said. "Like rain." Steam rose from the floor along with the smell of jasmine soap. Weeks later, we asked the cosmetics lady at Jacobson's for some jasmine soap we could smell. Father Moody stood outside the bathroom, too bashful to enter that moist cave that existed as a common room between the girls' 2 shared bedrooms. Inside, if he hadn't been a priest and had looked, he would have seen the throne-like toilet where the Lisbon girls defecated publicly, the bathtub they used as a couch, filling it with pillows, so that 2 sisters could luxuriate while another curled her hair. He would have seen the radiator stacked with glasses and Coke cans, the clamshell soap dish employed in a pinch as an ashtray. From the age of 12, Lux spent hours in the john smoking cigarettes, exhaling either out the window or into a wet towel she then hung outside. But Father Moody saw none of this. He only passed through the tropical air current, and that was all. Behind him he felt the colder drafts of the house, circulating dust motes in that particular family smell every house had. You knew it when you came in. Chase Buell's house smelled like skin, Joe Larson's like mayonnaise, the Lisbons like stale popcorn, we thought. Though Father Moody, going there after the deaths had begun, said, it was a mix between a funeral parlor and a broom closet. All those flowers, all that dust. He wanted to step back into the current of jasmine, but as he stood, listening to rain beating bathroom tiles and washing away the girls' footprints, he heard voices. He made a quick circuit of the hallway, calling out for Mrs. Lisbon, but she didn't respond. Returning to the top of the stairs, he had started down when he saw the Lisbon girls through a partly open doorway. At that point, those girls had no intention of repeating Cecilia's mistake. I know everyone thinks it was a plan or that we handled it poorly, but they were just as shocked as I was. Father Moody rapped softly on the door and asked for permission to enter. They were sitting on the floor together, and I could tell they'd been crying. I think they were having some kind of slumber party. They had pillows all over. I hate to mention it, and I remember scolding myself for even thinking it at the time, but it was unmistakable. They hadn't bathed. We asked Father Moody whether he had discussed Cecilia's death or the girl's grief, but he said he hadn't. I brought it up a few times, but they didn't take up the subject. I've learned that you can't force it. The time has to be right and the heart willing. When we asked him to sum up his impression of the girl's emotional state at that point, he said, buffeted, but not broken. In the first few days after the funeral, our interest in the Lisbon girls only increased. Added to their loveliness was a new mysterious suffering, perfectly silent, visible in the blue puffiness beneath their eyes or the way that they would sometimes stop in mid-stride, look down and shake their heads as though disagreeing with life. Grief made them wander. We heard reports of the girls walking aimlessly through Eastland, down the lighted mall with its timid fountains and hot dogs impaled beneath heat lamps. Now and then they fingered a blouse or dress, but bought nothing. Woody Clabolt saw Lux Lisbon talking to a motorcycle gang outside Hudson's. One biker asked her to go for a ride, and after looking in the direction of her house, more than 10 miles away, she accepted. She hugged his waist. He kicked the machine into life. Later, Lux was seen walking home alone, carrying her shoes. In the Kriegers' basement, we lay on a strip of leftover carpeting and dreamed of all the ways we could soothe the Lisbon girls. Some of us wanted to lay down in the grass with them, or play them guitar and sing them songs. Paul Baldino wanted to take them to Metro Beach, so that they could all get a tan. Chase Buell, more and more under the sway of his father, the Christian Scientist, said only that the girls needed help not of this world. But when we asked him what he meant, he shrugged and said, nothing. Nevertheless, when the girls walked by, we often found him crouching by a tree, moving his lips with his eyes closed. Not everyone thought about the girls, however. Even before Cecilia's funeral, some people could talk of nothing but the dangerousness of the fence she jumped on. It was an accident waiting to happen, said Mr. Frank, who worked in insurance. You couldn't get a policy to cover it. Our kids could jump on it, too, Mrs. Zaretti insisted during coffee hour following Sunday Mass. Not long after, a group of fathers began digging the fence out, free of charge. It turned out the fence stood on the Batisse's property. Mr. Buck, a lawyer, negotiated with Mr. Bates about the fence's removal, and didn't speak to Mr. Lisbon at all. Everyone assumed, of course, that the Lisbons would be grateful. We had rarely seen our fathers in work boots before, toiling in the earth and wielding brand-new root clippers. They struggled with the fence, bent over like Marines hoisting the flag in Iwo Jima. It was the greatest show of common effort we could remember in our neighborhood. All those lawyers, doctors, and mortgage bankers locked arm in arm in the trench, with our mothers bringing out orange Kool-Aid, and for a moment our century was noble again. Even the sparrows on the telephone lines seemed to be watching. No cars passed. The industrial fog of our city made the men resemble figures hammered into pewter, but by late afternoon they still couldn't uproot the fence. Mr. Hutch got the idea of hacksawing the bars as the paramedics had, and for a while the men took turns sawing, but their paper-pushing arms gave out quickly. Finally they tied the fence to the back of Uncle Tucker's four-wheel-drive Bronco. Nobody cared that Uncle Tucker didn't have a license. Driving examiners always smelled booze on him. Even if he quit drinking 3 days before the test, they still smelled it evaporating from his pores. Our fathers just cried, "Hit it!" and Uncle Tucker floored his accelerator. But the fence didn't budge. By mid-afternoon they abandoned the effort and took up a collection to hire a professional hauling service. An hour later a lone man showed up in a tow truck, attached a hook to the fence, pressed a button to make his giant winch revolve, and with a deep earth sound the murdering fence came loose. "You can see the blood," Anthony Turkis said, and we looked to see if the blood that hadn't been there at the time of the suicide had arrived after the fact. Some said it was on the third spike, some said the fourth, but it was as impossible as finding the bloody shovel on the back of Abbey Road, where all the clues proclaimed that Paul was dead. None of the Lisbons helped with the fence removal. From time to time, however, we saw their faces blinking at the windows. Just after the truck pulled the fence free, Mr. Lisbon himself came out of the side door and coiled up a garden hose. He didn't move to the trench. He raised one hand in a neighborly salute and returned inside. The man lashed the fence in sections to his truck, and getting paid for it, gave Mr. Bates the worst lawn job we'd ever seen. We were amazed our parents permitted this, when lawn jobs usually justified calling the cops. But now Mr. Bates didn't scream or try to get the truck's license plate, nor did Mrs. Bates, who had once wept when we set off firecrackers in her State Fair tulips. They said nothing, and our parents said nothing, so that we sensed how ancient they were, how accustomed to trauma, depressions, and wars. We realized that the version of the world they rendered for us was not the world they really believed in, and that for all their caretaking and bitching about crabgrass, they didn't give a damn about lawns. After the truck drove away, our fathers gathered around the hole once more, staring down at wriggling earthworms, kitchen spoons, the one rock Paul Little swore was an Indian arrowhead. They leaned on shovels, mopping brows even though they hadn't done anything. Everyone felt a lot better, as though the lake had been cleaned up, or the air, or the other side's bombs destroyed. There wasn't much you could do to save us, but at least the fence was gone. Despite the devastation of his lawn, Mr. Bates did some edging, and the old German couple appeared in their grape arbor to drink dessert wine. As usual, they wore their alpine hats, Mr. Hessen's with a tiny green feather, while their schnauzer sniffed at the end of his leash. Grapes burst above their heads. Mrs. Hessen's humped back dove and surfaced amid her swelling rose bushes as she sprayed. At some point we looked up into the sky to see that all the fish flies had died. The air was no longer brown, but blue. Using kitchen brooms, we swept bugs from poles and windows and electrical lines. We stuffed them into bags. Thousands upon thousands of insect bodies with wings of raw silk, and Tim Winter, the brain, pointed out how the fish flies' tails resembled those of lobsters. "They're smaller," he said, "but possess the same basic design. Lobsters are classified in the phylum Arthropoda, same as insects. They're bugs, and bugs are only lobsters that have learned to fly." No one ever understood what got into us that year or why we hated so intensely the crust of dead bugs over our lives. Suddenly, however, we couldn't bear the fish flies carpeting our swimming pools, filling our mailboxes, blotting out stars on our flags. The collective action of digging the trench led to cooperative sweeping, bag carting, patio hosing. A score of brooms kept time in all directions as the pale ghosts of fish flies dropped from walls like ash. We examined their tiny wizards' faces, rubbing them between our fingers until they gave off the scent of carp. We tried to light them, but they wouldn't burn, which made the fish flies seem deader than anything. We hit bushes, beat rugs, turned on windshield wipers full blast. Fish flies clogged sewer grates so that we had to stuff them down with sticks. Crouching over sewers, we could hear the river under the city flowing away. We dropped rocks and listened for the splash. We didn't stop with our own houses. Once our walls were clean, Mr. Buell told Chase to start cleaning bugs off the Lisbon house. Because of his religious beliefs, Mr. Buell often went the extra mile, raking 10 feet into the Hessens' yard, or shoveling their walk and even throwing down rock salt. It wasn't odd for him to tell Chase to start sweeping the Lisbons' house, even though they lived across the street and not next door. Because Mr. Lisbon only had daughters, boys and men had gone over in the past to help him drag away lightning-struck limbs. And as Chase approached, holding his broom over his head like a regimental banner, nobody said a word. Then, however, Mr. Krieger told Kyle to go over and sweep some, and Mr. Hutch sent Ralph, and soon we were all over at the Lisbon house, brushing walls and scraping away bug husks. They had even more than we did. The walls an inch thick, and Paul Baldino asked us the riddle, "What smells like fish is fun to eat but isn't fish?" Once we got to the Lisbons' windows, our new inexplicable feelings for the girls came to the fore. As we slapped off bugs, we saw Mary Lisbon in the kitchen, holding a box of Kraft macaroni and cheese. She appeared to be contemplating whether or not to open it. She read the directions, turned the box over to look at the vivid picture of the noodles, and then put the box back on the counter. Anthony Turkis, pressing his face to the window, said, "She should eat something." She picked up the box again. Hopefully we watched, but then she turned and disappeared. Outside it grew dark. Lights came on down the block, but not in the Lisbon house. We couldn't see in any better, and in fact the glass panes began to reflect our own gaping faces. It was only 9 o'clock, but everything confirmed what people had been saying, that since Cecilia's suicide, the Lisbons could hardly wait for night to forget themselves and sleep. Up in a bedroom window, Bonnie's 3 votive candles glimmered in a reddish haze, but otherwise the house absorbed the shadows of night. Insects started up in their hiding places all around, vibrating the minute we turned our backs. Everyone called them crickets, but we never found any in the sprayed bushes or aerated lawns, and had no idea what they looked like. They were merely sound. Our parents had been more intimate with crickets. For them, the buzzing apparently didn't sound mechanical. It came from every direction, always from a height just above our heads or just below, and always with a suggestion that the insect world felt more than we did. As we stood charmed into stillness, listening to the crickets, Mr. Lisbon came out the side door and thanked us. His hair looked even grayer than usual, but grief hadn't altered the highness of his voice. He had on overalls, one knee covered by sawdust. "Feel free to use the hose," he said, and then he looked at the good humor truck passing by. The jingle of the bell seemed to trigger a memory. He smiled, or winced, he couldn't tell which, and returned inside. We went with him only later, invisibly, with the ghost of our questions. Apparently, as he stepped back inside, he saw Therese come out of the dining room. She was stuffing her mouth with candy, M&Ms by the colors, but stopped immediately on seeing him. She swallowed an unchewed chunk. Her high forehead glowed in the light from the street, and her Cupid's lips were redder, smaller, and more shapely than he remembered, especially in contrast to her cheeks and chin, which had gained weight. Her eyelashes were crusted, as though recently glued shut. At that moment, Mr. Lisbon had the feeling that he didn't know who she was, that children were only strangers you agreed to live with, and he reached out in order to meet her for the first time. He rested his hands on her shoulders, then dropped them to his sides. Therese brushed the hair out of her face, smiled, and began walking slowly up the stairs. Mr. Lisbon went on his usual nighttime rounds, checking to see that the front door was locked. It wasn't. That the garage light was off. It was. And that none of the burners on the stove had been left on. None had. He turned off the light in the first-floor bathroom, where he found Kyle Krieger's retainer in the sink, left from when he'd taken it out during the party to eat cake. Mr. Lisbon ran the retainer under water, examining the pink shell form-fitted to the roof of Kyle's mouth, the crenellations in the plastic that encircled the turret of his teeth, the looping front wire bent at key spots. You could see plier marks, to provide modulated pressure. Mr. Lisbon knew his parental and neighborly duty entailed putting the retainer in a Ziploc bag, calling the Kriegers, and telling them their expensive orthodontal device was in safekeeping. Acts like these, simple, humane, conscientious, forgiving, held life together. Only a few days earlier he would have been able to perform them, but now he took the retainer and dropped it in the toilet. He pressed the handle. The retainer, jostled in the surge, disappeared down the porcelain throat, and when waters abated, floated triumphantly, mockingly out. Mr. Lisbon waited for the tank to refill and flushed again, but the same thing happened. The replica of the boy's mouth clung to the white slope. At that point, something flashed in the corner of his eye. I thought I saw somebody, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Nor did he see anything as he came around the back hall into the foyer and up the front stairs. On the second floor, he listened at the girls' doors, but heard only Mary coughing in her sleep. Lux playing a radio softly, singing along. He stepped into the girls' bathroom. A beam of light from the risen moon penetrated the window, lighting up a portion of mirror. Amid smudged fingerprints, a small circle had been wiped clean, where his daughters contemplated their images. And above the mirror itself, Bonnie had taped a white construction paper dove. Mr. Lisbon parted his lips in a grimace and saw in the clean circle the one dead canine tooth beginning to turn green on the left side of his mouth. The doors to the girls' shared bedrooms were not completely closed. Breathings and murmurings issued from them. He listened to the sounds as though they could tell him what the girls were feeling and how to comfort them. Lux switched her radio off and everything was silent. I couldn't go in, Mr. Lisbon confessed to us years later. I didn't know what to say. Only as he left the bathroom, heading for the oblivion of sleep himself, did Mr. Lisbon see Cecilia's ghost. She was standing in her old bedroom, dressed in the wedding dress again, having somehow shed the beige dress with the lace collar she'd worn in her coffin. The window was still open, Mr. Lisbon said. I don't think we'd ever remembered to shut it. It was all clear to me. I knew I had to close that window or else she'd go on jumping out of it forever. According to his story, he didn't cry out. He didn't want to make contact with the shade of his daughter, to learn why she had done herself in, to ask forgiveness, or to rebuke her. He merely rushed forward, brushing past, to close the window. As he did, however, the ghost turned, and he saw that it was only Bonnie, wrapped in a bedsheet. Don't worry, she said quietly. They took the fence out. In a handwritten note displaying the penmanship perfected during his graduate school days in Zurich, Dr. Horniker called Mr. and Mrs. Lisbon in for a second consultation, but they didn't go. Instead, from what we observed during the remainder of the summer, Mrs. Lisbon once more took charge of the house while Mr. Lisbon receded into a mist. When we saw him after that, he had the sheepish look of a poor relation. By late August, in the weeks of preparation before school, he began leaving by the back door as though sneaking out. His car would whine inside the garage, and when the automatic door rose, would emerge tentatively, lopsided like an animal missing a leg. Through the windshield we could see Mr. Lisbon at the wheel, his hair still wet and his face sometimes dabbed with shaving cream. But he made no expression when the tailpipe hit the end of the driveway, sending sparks, as it did every time. At 6 o'clock he returned home. As he came up the drive, the garage doors shuddered to engulf him, and then we wouldn't see him until the next morning, when the clanging tailpipe announced his departure. The only extensive contact with the girls occurred late in August when Mary showed up without an appointment at Dr. Becker's orthodontal office. We talked to him years later, while dozens of plaster dental casts grinned crookedly down at us from glass cabinets. Each set of teeth bore the name of the unfortunate child who'd been made to swallow the cement, and the sight took us back to the medieval torture of our own orthodontal histories. Dr. Becker spoke for some time before we paid attention, for once again we could feel him hammering metal clasps over our molars or stringing our upper and lower teeth together with rubber bands. Our tongues searched out pockets of scar tissue left by jutting back braces, and even 15 years later the fissures still seemed sweet with blood. But Dr. Becker was saying, I remember Mary because she came in without her parents. No kid had ever done that before. When I asked her what she wanted, she put 2 fingers in her mouth and pulled up her front lip. Then she said, 'How much?' She was worried her parents wouldn't be able to pay." Dr. Becker declined to give Mary Lisbon an estimate. "Bring your mother in and we'll talk about it," he said. In fact, the process would have been extensive, as Mary, like her sisters, appeared to have 2 extra canine teeth. Disappointed, she lay back in the dentist's chair, her feet raised while a silver tube churned water into a sucking cup. "I had to leave her sitting in the chair," Dr. Becker said. "I had 5 other kids waiting. Later, my nurse told me she heard the girl crying." The girls didn't appear as a group until convocation. On September 7th, a day whose coolness dampened hopes for an Indian summer, Mary, Bonnie, Lux, and Therese came to school as though nothing had happened. Once again, despite their closed ranks, we could see the new differences among them, and we felt that if we kept looking hard enough, we might begin to understand what they were feeling and who they were. Mrs. Lisbon hadn't taken the girls to buy new school clothes, so they wore last year's. Their prim dresses were too tight, despite everything the girls had continued to develop, and they looked uncomfortable. Mary had spruced up her outfit with accessories, a bracelet bunch of wooden cherries, the same bright red as her scarf. Lux's school tartan, too short by now, exposed her naked knees and an inch of thigh. Bonnie wore a tent-like something, with meandering trim. Therese had on a white dress that looked like a lab coat. Nevertheless, the girls filed in with an unexpected dignity as a hush fell over the auditorium. Bonnie had picked a simple bouquet of late-season dandelions from the school green. She held them under Lux's chin to see if she liked butter. Their recent shock was undetectable, but sitting down they left a folding seat empty, as though saving it for Cecilia. The girls didn't miss a single day of classes, nor did Mr. Lisbon, who taught with his usual enthusiasm. He continued to pump students for answers by pretending to strangle them, and scratched out equations in a cloud of chalk dust. At lunchtime, however, rather than going to the teacher's lounge, he began to eat in his classroom, bringing a cafeteria apple and plate of cottage cheese back to his desk. He showed other odd behavior. We saw him walking along the science wing, conversing with spider plants hanging from the geodesic panes. After the first week, he taught from his swivel chair, wheeling back and forth to the blackboard and never standing up, explaining that this was because of his blood sugar level. After school, as assistant soccer coach, he stood behind the goal listlessly calling out the score, and when practice finished, wandered the chalk-dusted field, collecting soccer balls in a soiled canvas bag. He drove to school alone, an hour earlier than his late-sleeping, bussed-in daughters. Entering the main door past the suit of armor, our athletic teams were called the Knights, he went straight into his classroom, where the 9 planets of our solar system hung from perforated ceiling panels, 66 holes in each square, according to Joe Hill Conley, who counted them during class. Nearly invisible white strings attached the planets to a track. Each day they rotated and revolved, the whole cosmos controlled by Mr. Lisbon, who consulted an astronomy chart and turned a crank next to the pencil sharpener. Beneath the planets hung black and white triangles, orange helices, blue cones with detachable noses. On his desk, Mr. Lisbon displayed a soma cube, solved for all time in a ribbon of Scotch tape. Beside the blackboard, a wire clamp held 5 sticks of chalk so that he could draw sheet music for his male singing group. He'd been a teacher so long he had a sink in his room. The girls, on the other hand, entered through the side door past the bed of dormant daffodils, tended each spring by the headmaster's slim, industrious wife. Scattering to separate lockers, they reunited in the cafeteria during juice break. Julie Freeman had been Mary Lisbon's best friend, but after the suicide they stopped talking. "She was a neat kid, but I just sort of couldn't deal with it. She sort of freaked me out. Also, I was starting to go out with Todd by then." The sisters walked with poise down the halls, carrying books over their chests and staring at a fixed point in space we couldn't see. They were like Aeneas, who, as we translated him into existence amid the cloud of Dr. Timmerman's B.O., had gone down to the underworld, seen the dead, and returned weeping on the inside. Who knew what they were thinking or feeling? Lux still giggled stupidly. Bonnie fingered the rosary deep in the pocket of her corduroy skirt. Mary wore her suits that made her resemble the First Lady. Therese kept her protective goggles on in the halls, but they receded from us, from the other girls, from their father, and we caught sight of them standing in the courtyard under drizzle, taking bites from the same donut, looking up at the sky, letting themselves get slowly drenched. We spoke to them in snatches, each of us adding a sentence to a communal conversation. Mike Orio was first. His locker was next to Mary's, and one day he peeked over its rim and said, "How's it going?" Her head was bent forward, throwing her hair over her face, and he wasn't sure she'd heard him until she mumbled, "Not bad." Without turning to meet his eyes, she slammed the metal locker shut and moved away, clutching her books. After a few steps, she tugged down the back of her skirt. The next day, he waited for her, and when she opened her locker, added a new phrase. "I'm Mike." This time, Mary said something distinct through her hair. "I know who you are. I've only been at this school for, my whole life." Mike Rio wanted to say something more, but when she finally turned to face him, he went mute. He stood staring at her, opening his mouth uselessly, until she said, "You don't have to talk to me." Other guys were more successful. Chip Willard, the detention king, walked up to Lux as she was sitting in a pool of sunshine. It was one of the last warm days of the year, and as we watched from a second-story dormer, he sat down beside her. Lux was wearing her school tartan and white knee socks. Her topsiders looked new. Before Willard had walked up, she'd been idly rubbing them in the dirt. Then she spread her legs out, propped her hands behind her back, and turned her face towards the last rays of the season. Willard moved into her sun and spoke. She brought her legs together, scratched one knee, and drew them apart. Willard settled his bulk on the soft ground. He leaned towards her, grinning, and even though he had never said anything intelligent within our hearing, he made Lux laugh. He seemed to know what he was doing, and we were astounded at the knowledge he had gained in the basements and bleachers of his delinquency. He crumpled a dead leaf over Lux's head. Bits fell down the back of her shirt, and she hit him. The next thing we knew, they were walking together around back of the school, out past the tennis courts, through the row of memorial elms, and to the towering fence that marked the property of the mansions of the private drive beyond. It wasn't only Willard. Paul Wanamaker, Kurt Siles, Peter McGuire, Tom Sellers, and Jim Cheslowski all had their few days of going steady with Lux. It was well known that Mr. and Mrs. Lisbon didn't allow their daughters to date, and that Mrs. Lisbon in particular disapproved of dances, proms, and the general expectation that teenagers should be allowed to paw one another in back seats. Lux's brief unions were clandestine. They sprouted in the dead time of study halls, bloomed on the way to the drinking fountain, and were consummated in the hot box above the auditorium, amid uncomfortable theatrical lights and cables. The boys met Lux in transit on sanctioned errands, in the aisle of the pharmacy while Mrs. Lisbon waited outside in the car, and once in the most daring rendezvous, in the station wagon itself, for the 15 minutes Mrs. Lisbon stood in line at the bank. But the boys who snuck off with Lux were always the stupidest boys, the most selfish and abused at home, and they made terrible sources of information. No matter what we asked, they responded with lewd assertions, such as, "Squeezebox, all right. Let me tell you." Or, "You want to know what happened? Smell my fingers, man." That Lux consented to meet them in the dells and thickets of our school grounds only showed too well her disequilibrium. We asked whether she spoke about Cecilia, but the boys always said they hadn't exactly been talking, if you know what I mean. The only reliable boy who got to know Lux during that time was Tripp Fontaine, but his sense of honor kept us in the dark for years. Only 18 months before the suicides, Tripp Fontaine had emerged from baby fat to the delight of girls and women alike. Because we had known him as a pudgy boy whose teeth slanted out of his open, trolling mouth like those of a deep-sea fish, we had been slow to recognize his transformation. In addition, our fathers and older brothers, our decrepit uncles, had assured us that looks didn't matter if you were a boy. We weren't on the lookout for handsomeness appearing in our midst, and believed it counted for little until the girls we knew, along with their mothers, fell in love with Tripp Fontaine. Their desire was silent yet magnificent, like 1,000 daisies attuning their faces towards the path of the sun. At first we hardly noticed the wadded notes drop through the grating of Tripp's locker, nor the equatorial breezes pursuing him down the hall from so much heated blood. But finally, confronted with clusters of clever girls blushing at Tripp's approach, or yanking their braids to keep from smiling too much, we realized that our fathers, brothers, and uncles had been lying, and that no one was ever going to love us because of our good grades. Years later, from the one-horse detoxification ranch, where Tripp Fontaine had gone to dry out on the last of his ex-wife's savings, he recalled the red-hot passions that had erupted at a time when he was growing his first chest hair. It began during a trip to Acapulco, when his father and his father's boyfriend went for a stroll on the beach, leaving Tripp to fend for himself on the hotel grounds. Exhibit 7, a snapshot taken during that trip, shows a bronzed Mr. Fontaine posing with Donald, the two of them squeezed thigh to thigh, within the palmy Montezuma throne of a hotel patio chair. At the no-drinking-age bar, Tripp met Gina DeSander, recently divorced, who ordered him his first pina colada. Always a gentleman, Tripp Fontaine imparted to us upon his return only the most proper details of Gina DeSander's life. That she was a dealer in Las Vegas and taught him to win at blackjack. That she wrote poetry and ate raw coconut with a Swiss Army knife. Only years later, looking over the desert with ruined eyes, his chivalry no longer able to protect a woman by that time in her 50s, did Tripp confess that Gina DeSander had been my first lady. It explained a lot. It explained why he never took off the puka shell necklace she'd given him. It explained the travel poster over his bed showing a man soaring over Acapulco Bay on a kite pulled by a speedboat. It explained why he changed his manner of dress the year before the suicides, going from schoolboy shirts and pants to Western outfits, shirts with pearl buttons, decorative pocket flaps, and shoulder stitching. Every item chosen in order to resemble the Las Vegas men who stood arm in arm with Gina DeSander in the wallet photographs she showed Tripp during their 7 days and 6 nights package tour together.